I stood outside the Charlotte hospital, my abdomen burning from a fresh incision, clutching a bag smaller than my shattered pride. The luxury car I bought them idled just long enough for a crumpled $20 bill to hit the puddle at my feet. "Take a taxi," my mother sneered. "I do not want my car smelling like a hospital." They had no idea that $20 toss would cost them their entire parasitic empire. My name is Zoe Jenkins, 34 years old. 48 hours ago, I was in emergency surgery having my abdomen sliced open to save my life. Now, I was standing on the curb outside the Charlotte hospital, vibrating with a level of pain that felt like someone was trying to unzip me from the inside out. Every breath was a negotiation with my own body, a shallow intake that ended in a sharp, blinding staccato of agony where the scalpel had done its work. The air outside was humid, that thick North Carolina summer heat that usually felt like a warm blanket, but today, it felt oppressive, heavy enough to weigh me down. I was sweating, not from the temperature, but from the sheer, white-knuckled effort it took just to keep my feet. My left arm was still taped and sore from the IV lines, and in my right hand, I gripped the thin, plastic drawstring hospital bag like it was a lifeline. It contained nothing but the sweatpants I had arrived in, a toothbrush, and the tattered remainders of my self-respect, which I could almost feel draining away with every minute I stood there. I was fighting a war on two fronts, the screaming pain in my midsection and the creeping, toxic shame of waiting for my parents. I was CEO of Meridian Harbor Risk Advisory. I managed million-dollar accounts and consulted on high-stakes corporate disasters. I was built for resilience, for control. But right now, standing there, I felt reduced to a small, frightened girl who just needed someone to take care of her. I had called them after I woke up from anesthesia. They hadn't picked up the first 4 times. When my mother, Celeste, finally answered, her first question wasn't about the surgery. It was why I was calling her at 4 o'clock on a Tuesday. I had explained, my voice thinned by the narcotics and the terror I was still feeling, and I begged for a ride. Not a week of care, not even a dinner, just 15 minutes in a car to get me home. Against every rational thought I had cultivated over 34 years of being their daughter, against the mountain of evidence that proved they were incapable of genuine altruism, a tiny, idiotic spark of hope still flickered in my chest. I wanted them to be parents, just this once. I wanted to see their black, oversized Chevy Tahoe, a car I had paid for entirely, pull up to the curb. I wanted my father, Graham, to step out with that practiced, weary sigh he used when he was called to fix my mistakes. But at least he would open the door. I wanted my mother to maybe, just maybe, touch my arm and say something that wasn't a complaint. I was a professional at managing risk, and I had managed to fool myself into believing that the risk of their rejection was worth the hope of their support. It was the absolute height of my vulnerability. The hospital doors slid open and closed behind me, a sterile rhythm I knew by heart now, mocking my anticipation. I checked my watch, but my eyes were too blurry from pain and unshed tears to read the time. The sidewalk seemed to vibrate. The noise of traffic on King's Drive was amplified, a cacophony of engines and horns that assaulted my ears. A woman walked by pushing a baby stroller, smiling, totally unaware of the battle occurring 5 feet away from her. I felt exposed, an open wound waiting to be infected by the harsh realities of the outside world. I closed my eyes for a second, fighting nausea, and pictured the soft sheets of my bed. That's all I needed. Just the bed. Just to lie down. That was when the Tahoe pulled up. It was 20 minutes late, but a surge of relief hit me so hard I almost buckled. There it was, a glossy, $65,000 monolith of engineering that I had purchased 72 weeks ago for their retirement ease. I saw the tinted glass windows that I had also paid to install. The car didn't stop at the designated pickup spot. It just slowed down, hovering like a sleek predator right in front of me, partially blocking traffic and ignoring the annoyed horn honk from the car behind them. I tried to push off the brick wall I was leaning against. I was smiling, a grimace of pain and gratitude. "Thank God," I whispered to the humid air. I started to take that agonizing first step forward, the world tilting slightly. I was preparing my apologies for making them come out. I was getting my story ready to explain the surgery without annoying them with the details of my brush with death. The doors didn't open. The heavy, insulated, safety-rated doors that separated my parents from the filth of the outside world remained sealed. Instead, I heard the mechanical hum of the passenger window being lowered, just an inch. Just enough for my mother to communicate. I could see the edge of her perfectly blown-out hair. Hair I knew had cost $300 at the salon downtown yesterday, because I was the secondary user on that credit card account. I froze on the sidewalk, my progress halted by confusion. "Ma?" I croaked, my voice cracking. A hand emerged from the thin gap in the glass. It was my mother's hand. I knew it, not by sight, but by the flash of the heavy, 5-carat diamond ring she wore. A ring my father had given her, paid for with the bonus I had helped secure for him a decade ago before I started my own company. Her hand was turned downward. She wasn't reaching out to pull me in. She was holding something, a small, wet green object, before my narcotic-slowed brain could process what was happening. Her fingers released the object. It fell. It didn't drift gently. It dropped with a purposeful, lazy weight through the inches of humid air. I watched it land. It missed the dry pavement of the sidewalk by an inch and fell directly into a disgusting, oily puddle of dirty water right at my feet. It was a single, crumpled, $20 bill. "Take a taxi." Zoe, my mother's voice, drifted out, sounding metallic and distant through the glass, like she was talking to a problematic employee through an intercom. There was zero emotion in her tone, just a flat, nasal annoyance. "Your father does not want the new car smell ruined. I will not have my car smelling like disinfectants in a hospital all afternoon. Go find a cab like a normal person and do not call us until you can behave properly." I didn't see my father. He sat at the wheel, his profile partially visible. He didn't turn his head. He didn't look at me once. Not even a glimpse of judgment, just total, apathetic disregard. He just kept his eyes on the road ahead, waiting for the conversation to finish. Before the last word had even left her mouth, the hum of the window starting to raise again filled the silence, the dark glass sealed. I was looking at my own reflection. I was looking at a woman who was a CEO, a daughter, and now, apparently, a health hazard with a value of exactly $20. The Tahoe immediately accelerated, a $75,000 machine leaving me in a cloud of diesel fumes and rejection. Speeding off toward the safety of the leafy suburbs, I continued to finance. The force of the humiliation hit me harder than the physical pain had. I stood there, surrounded by strangers who were pretending not to look, my mouth slightly ajar, my breath leaving me in ragged gasps. The hospital bag slipped from my fingers, hitting the sidewalk with a pathetic thud. The tiny spark of hope I had held onto didn't just flicker out, it was extinguished with the equivalent of a psychological fire hose. The silence in that Tahoe, the calculated casualness of the $20 throw, the refusal to look me in the eye, that was the moment. The very specific, irreversible point in time where 34 years of loyalty and daughterly duty didn't just bend, they snapped into two jagged, sharp pieces that were now threatening to bleed me dry. I didn't cry. There was zero emotion left to waste on tears. I just felt a cold, deep, terrifying clarity settle over my skin. More freezing than any hospital room, I was no longer the daughter Zoe Jenkins. I was the architect of Meridian Harbor. I was a risk consultant who had just been handed the easiest puzzle of my career. The problem was simple. My parents, who lived completely on my credit, who I had spent my entire adult life providing for, had decided that I was less important than the smell of their car. My brain, the precise, analytical engine that had made me a multimillionaire, started running the numbers. I slowly, agonizingly, forced myself to bend at the waist. Every single muscle in my abdomen shrieked in protest. The heat was blinding. The oily, filthy water of the puddle seeped around the $20 bill. I didn't care. I needed that bill. I wasn't just taking their money. I was retrieving my new operating capital. My fingers, shaking with pain and an icy, newfound fury, closed around the wet, $20 bill. As I lifted it out of the dirty water, I felt the stitches at my midsection pull, a terrifying tearing sensation that was worth every second. I wasn't the weak, frightened girl anymore. I was a victim who had just been given her opening statement. I watched their Tahoe disappear into the midday traffic and I smiled. A real, sharp, predatory smile that was devoid of any hope. I wasn't waiting for them to pick me up. I was waiting for them to start begging. I pulled out my phone with one hand, gripping the wet $20 bill in the other. I didn't pull up my contact list for mom or dad. I opened my Uber app. I didn't type in the address to the magnificent 5-bedroom craftsman house in the country club neighborhood that I had purchased for Graham and Celeste 5 years ago. The house that they always described as the perfect family home to their envious friends. I typed in the address of a sleek, 98th floor glass and steel apartment building in the heart of downtown Charlotte. A 2-bedroom penthouse that I had bought as a distressed asset 3 years ago and had never, not once, mentioned to my parents. It didn't exist. To me, it was now ground zero for the next 3 months of my recovery, and the launching pad for the systematic dismantling of their fraudulent, parasitic reality. I looked at the wet $20 bill in my hand. I wasn't using it for the ride. I was using it as a prop in the final scene of the family drama. I had a story to finish, and it wasn't going to be about my forgiveness. I stepped into the waiting Uber, and I left that hospital, and that daughter, behind me. 6 months before I found myself bleeding on the pavement. My life was a masterclass in high-functioning masochism. I was the founder and chief executive officer of Meridian Harbor Risk Advisory. If a regional bank president got caught embezzling, or a tech startup faced a massive data breach, my phone rang. I built that firm from a folding table in a windowless studio apartment into a premier crisis management agency in Charlotte. It took blood, sweat, and a diet consisting mostly of black coffee and adrenaline. I lived on a strict schedule of 14-hour workdays, sometimes 16 when a client's stock price was plummeting towards zero. I did not have weekends. I had periods of less intense panic where I could briefly catch my breath before the next corporate fire broke out. And while I was navigating boardrooms and drafting press releases at 2 in the morning, Graham and Celeste were busy perfecting the art of professional leisure. They wore their luxurious lifestyle like a bespoke suit, perfectly tailored and entirely unearned. To them, the velvet ropes of Charlotte's upper crust were not barriers. They were welcome mats, laid out by the sheer force of my bank accounts. I paid for their sprawling 5-bedroom house. I paid the exorbitant property taxes. I paid the steep monthly dues at the Brookglass Civic Club so my father could play 18 holes of golf with retired judges and hedge fund managers. I funded their winter trips to the mountains and their summer escapes to the European coast. I covered their premium concierge medical insurance, the landscaping service, the pool maintenance, and the weekly delivery of organic groceries. These were not luxuries to them. They considered this their baseline, the absolute minimum standard of living they were owed simply for existing and bringing me into the world. The truly maddening part was the narrative they spun for their social circle. If you sat next to my mother at a charity luncheon, she would lean in, swirling her expensive glass of imported wine, and sigh about how hard it was to raise a driven child. She would talk about the sacrifices they made, the countless hours they spent nurturing my ambition. My father would nod solemnly at the country club bar, telling anyone who would listen that he taught me everything I knew about business strategy. It was a spectacular, infuriating fiction. The only thing they ever taught me about business was the concept of a terrible investment. They had not sacrificed a single comfort for my success. They simply hitched their wagon to my engine and let me pull them up the mountain while they enjoyed the view. But the financial drain, as massive as it numbered in the hundreds of thousands of dollars annually, was not what was hollowing me out. Money was just math on a spreadsheet. I could always negotiate another contract. I could always make more money. What left me utterly exhausted, bone-tired in a way that 8 hours of sleep could never fix, was the sheer dehumanization of my role in their lives. I was not a daughter. I was a walking, breathing trust fund, I was an unlimited black credit card with a pulse. They never called to ask if I was eating well. They never called to ask if the stress of a hostile takeover campaign was getting to me. I recall one specific Tuesday during that period. I had worked a 70-hour week by that point, dragging myself home with a migraine that blurred the edges of my vision. My phone buzzed on the passenger seat. It was Celeste. She did not ask how many hours I had slept. She did not ask if I had eaten dinner. She asked if I could authorize a temporary $20,000 increase on her secondary credit card because her interior decorator found a set of antique French dining chairs that were simply perfect for the sunroom. When I hesitated, telling her I was driving and exhausted, her tone instantly shifted to a sharp, brittle disappointment, implying that I was ruining her creative vision for the house I owned. My father was exactly the same. A conversation with Graham Jenkins was always a transaction masquerading as parental interest. He would ask about a high-profile case I was handling, not because he cared about my professional growth, but because he wanted to gauge what my year-end dividend might look like. He needed to know if he could comfortably upgrade his wine cellar with rare vintages, or if he should wait until the next fiscal quarter. I was a human stock ticker to them, and as long as my value was trending upward, they were content to tolerate my presence. I remember a Friday night dinner party they hosted 3 months before the surgery. I had paid the catering bill, which amounted to $4,000 for hors d'oeuvres and prime rib. I arrived late, wearing the same suit I had worn since 6 in the morning. I was running on empty, desperate for a quiet corner and a warm meal. Instead of welcoming me, my mother pulled me aside into the hallway. She looked me up and down, her eyes critical. She told me I looked exhausted and that my pale face was bringing down the mood of the party. She suggested I go upstairs and rest so I would not ruin the aesthetic of her perfect evening with her high society friends. I was allowed to fund the banquet, but I was not polished enough to sit at the table. From the outside, looking in through the manicured hedges and the wrought iron security gates, we were the quintessential American success story. The handsome, distinguished parents enjoying their golden years, supported by their brilliant, self-made daughter. We looked like a glossy magazine spread, but inside that pristine image, I was suffocating in plain sight. I was a draft horse, strapped into a heavy leather harness, pulling a massive gilded carriage. Inside the carriage, my parents sat on plush velvet cushions, complaining that the ride was too bumpy and that I needed to trot a little faster so they would not be late for their dinner reservations. The realization did not hit me all at once. It was not a sudden, cinematic lightning strike of clarity. It was a slow, agonizing erosion of my spirit. It was the accumulation of 1,000 tiny slights, a million unspoken demands, and the deafening silence that followed any attempt I made to share my own personal struggles. I began to see the cold, hard truth lurking beneath their polished smiles and their practiced, hollow greetings. They did not love me. They did not care about the woman who liked to read historical biographies on rare Sunday mornings, or the woman who was secretly terrified of failure, or the woman who just wanted a hug that did not come with an invoice attached. They only loved what my name and my bank routing numbers could provide. They loved the premium access. They loved the elevated status. They loved the completely frictionless existence my relentless labor afforded them. I was retained in their lives not out of any biological bond or familial warmth, but simply because I was the strongest, most reliable financial asset they possessed in their portfolio. I was the load-bearing wall of their extravagant reality. If you removed me, the entire structure would collapse into dust. And the most tragic part of it all was that I had let them build it. I had handed them the bricks. I had mixed the mortar with my own sweat and youth. I had believed the fundamental lie that if I just bought them enough things, if I just made their lives perfectly comfortable and free of consequence, eventually, they would look at me and see a daughter worth loving for free. It took me 34 years to understand that their greed was a bottomless pit, and their capacity for genuine affection was a vacant lot. Those 6 months were a silent, grueling marathon of resentment building up in my chest. Every invoice I paid felt like a heavy stone added to a burden I was forced to carry. Every luxury vacation I funded felt like a direct insult to my own exhaustion. I was funding my own emotional starvation. I was keeping them swathed in cashmere and silk while I was slowly freezing to death inside. The foundation was already rotten long before I ever ended up in that hospital bed. The pavement and the puddle were just the physical end of a break that had been tearing my soul apart for months. It happened on a Tuesday evening in late October. The air outside was turning crisp, but inside the sprawling dining room of my parents' estate, the atmosphere was suffocatingly thick. I was seated at the long, polished mahogany table I had shipped directly from Milan for my mother's birthday 3 years prior. The crystal chandelier overhead cast a warm, expensive glow over a spread of roasted lamb and winter vegetables, a meal prepared by the private chef I kept on a monthly retainer. I was exhausted. I had spent the last 11 hours negotiating a hostile takeover defense for a client, my brain a tangled knot of legal clauses and risk assessments. I just wanted to eat in peace, maybe watch the fire in the hearth, and pretend for one night that I was simply a daughter visiting her family. But Graham and Celeste did not call me over for a casual meal. They called me over for a board meeting. My father waited until the chef had cleared the salad plates before he cleared his throat. It was his signature move, a practice sound that meant he was about to make a pronouncement. He leaned back in his custom-upholstered chair, swirling a glass of Cabernet that cost more than most people made in a week, and announced that they had found the perfect property. A lakefront vacation home on the most exclusive peninsula of Lake Norman. He described the wraparound decks, the private boat slip, and the sweeping views of the water. My mother chimed in, her eyes wide with a feverish excitement, explaining that 2 other couples from the Brookglass Civic Club were already bidding on houses in the same cove. They needed to secure this property to solidify their social standing. The earnest money deposit, my father casually stated, would be $300,000, and they needed me to wire the funds to their escrow account by Friday morning. I stopped chewing. The piece of lamb in my mouth suddenly tasted like sawdust. I looked from my father's expectant face to my mother's eager smile. For the first time in my adult life, I felt a hard, cold wall slam down inside my chest. I set my silver fork onto the porcelain plate. The soft clink echoed loudly in the cavernous room. I looked my father directly in the eye and told him no. I kept my voice steady, professional, stripping away the emotional weight of the word. I explained the reality of my firm's current situation. Meridian Harbor was facing a temporary but severe cash flow bottleneck. 2 of our largest enterprise clients had frozen their vendor payments due to internal audits. We were missing nearly $1 million in projected revenue for the quarter. While the company was not in imminent danger of bankruptcy, I had to exercise extreme fiscal caution. I needed to protect the payroll for my 65 employees and keep a solid operational reserve. My personal accounts were acting as a safety net. I could not, under any circumstances, liquidate $300,000 for a luxury summer home. I expected disappointment. I expected a sigh, maybe a complaint about bad timing. I did not expect the sheer, unadulterated venom that erupted across the table. Celeste's face turned a mottled, angry shade of crimson. She slammed both of her hands flat onto the mahogany wood, causing the crystal wine glasses to tremble. She did not ask about my employees. She did not ask if my business would survive the quarter. Instead, she shrieked that she had already told the club committee about the lake house. She had already promised to host the annual 4th of July regatta party on that specific deck. She accused me of humiliating her on purpose, of making her look like a boastful liar in front of the most important women in Charlotte. She acted as if my corporate cash flow crisis was a personal attack designed specifically to sabotage her social calendar. Graham did not yell. His anger was always colder, more surgical. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, and looked at me with a gaze dripping in condescension. He told me I was putting on a pathetic act. He accused me of fabricating this sudden financial crisis just to dodge my obligations to the family. He used that exact word. Obligations. He stated that I was wealthy enough to absorb a minor business hiccup and that I was simply being selfish. He then lowered his voice, delivering the killing blow. He implied that without my continuous financial backing, their entire social infrastructure would collapse. He made it crystal clear that in his mind, their prestigious reputation and their ability to impress their country club friends were vastly more important than my mental health, my financial security, or the survival of the company I had built from nothing. The dining room instantly transformed into a courtroom, and I was the prime suspect on the witness stand. The air grew incredibly thin. I felt a tight, agonizing band wrapping around my chest, cutting off my oxygen. I was being relentlessly interrogated, battered with guilt trips and accusations, simply because my wallet had momentarily snapped shut. Every single thing I had ever bought them, every bill I had ever paid, meant absolutely nothing in the face of this single refusal. I was drowning in their entitlement. The noise of their complaining blurred into a steady, deafening roar in my ears. I reached my absolute breaking point. I did not raise my voice. I did not offer another defense. I simply pushed my chair back. It scraped harshly against the floorboards. I stood up, left my napkin on the table, and walked away. I ignored my father demanding I sit back down. I walked out the heavy front doors, got into my car, and drove away into the dark night. I drove aimlessly for over an hour, my hands gripping the leather steering wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. I eventually found myself parking on the wet asphalt in front of a converted industrial warehouse in the South End district. It was the home of Briar McCall. Briar was a ruthless, terrifyingly sharp media strategist who routinely handled catastrophic public relations disasters for politicians and corporate executives. She was brilliant, entirely devoid of sentimentality, and the only genuine friend I had left in the world. More importantly, she was the only person who knew the meticulously hidden truth about the Jenkins family dynamic. I took the freight elevator to the 4th floor and knocked on her heavy steel door. Briar let me in, took one look at my pale face, and walked straight to her bar cart. She poured 2 fingers of neat bourbon into a heavy glass and shoved it into my hand. She guided me to her massive leather sofa and ordered me to speak. I sat there in the dimly lit loft, surrounded by exposed brick and modern art, and I spilled everything. I told her about the duck dinner, the $300,000 demand, the screaming, the accusations, and the sickening realization that my parents viewed my business solely as a printing press for their vanity projects. I talked until my throat burned and the glass in my hand was empty. Briar did not offer me a hug. She did not murmur sweet platitudes about how families go through rough patches. She sat in an armchair opposite me, her dark eyes pinning me to the cushions. She delivered the truth with the precision of a scalpel. She told me I was not acting like a daughter. I was acting like a hostage who had fallen in love with her captors. She pointed out that I had never actually tested their affection. I had spent my entire adult life preemptively paying my own ransom, buying their approval month after month, year after year. She said I had absolutely no idea if Graham and Celeste Jenkins loved me, or if they just fiercely loved the bulletproof, luxurious shield my money provided them against the real world. I stared at her, the harsh truth settling into my bones like lead. I wanted to argue, but I had zero ammunition left. Briar leaned forward, resting her chin on her hands, her mind already shifting into war room mode. She proposed a strategy, a loyalty test. She explicitly warned against faking a complete, destitute bankruptcy. That was too theatrical, too easily disproven by a simple credit check, and they would see right through it. Instead, she devised something far more insidious and entirely plausible in my industry, a simulated asset freeze. Briar outlined the narrative. We would construct a scenario where Meridian Harbor was caught in the crosshairs of a federal regulatory investigation due to a client's illegal activities. As the chief executive officer, my personal and business accounts would be temporarily frozen by court order pending an audit. The cash flow would not just slow down, it would hit a brick wall. The beauty of the plan was in its rigid, legalistic realism. I would not be asking them for a handout because I was a failure. I would be forced into sudden, temporary poverty by the heavy hand of the law. I would lose my credit cards, my ability to authorize transfers, and my independence. The test was simple. We would strip away the gold plating, shut down the automated teller machine they called a daughter, and see exactly what kind of parents remained when the money vanished. I looked at Briar, feeling a dangerous new resolve harden in my chest, and I told her to start drafting the plan. I sat in the leather armchair of Nolan Voss's downtown office on a rainy Thursday morning. Nolan was my personal attorney, a man whose suits were as sharp and uncompromising as his legal strategies. Together with Briar, we finalized the intricate details of our fabricated disaster. We needed a story airtight enough to survive Graham's cynical scrutiny, but terrifying enough to justify a complete and total financial blackout. The narrative we crafted was a masterpiece of corporate panic. I would claim that a major federal contractor Meridian Harbor advised had been flagged for massive compliance violations. As a result, pending an exhaustive and highly publicized audit, a federal injunction had supposedly mandated a temporary but absolute freeze on all executive compensation and personal banking accounts linked to my firm. The beauty of this lie was its paralyzing nature. I could not simply write a check or authorize a wire transfer without allegedly committing a federal felony. To sell the illusion of total defeat, I had to physically look the part. I stripped away the polished veneer of the chief executive officer. I packed 3 canvas duffel bags with plain denim jeans, faded college sweatshirts, and unbranded sneakers. I drove to the sprawling suburban estate in a rented economy sedan, leaving my usual luxury vehicle hidden in a secure downtown garage. When I walked through the heavy double doors of the house, I gathered Graham and Celeste in the sunroom. The morning light caught the dust motes in the air as I delivered the performance of my life. I kept my voice shaky, my shoulders slumped. I explained the audit, the frozen accounts, and the sudden, terrifying lack of liquidity. I told them I was forced to dramatically slash my own personal overhead immediately, which meant giving up my expensive city lease and moving out. I asked if I could stay in the spacious guest suite overlooking the rose gardens, just for a few months until the lawyers cleared my name and the accounts were unlocked. What I did not mention during this tearful plea, what Nolan had masterfully orchestrated 5 years ago when I first acquired this magnificent property, was the true nature of the deed. Graham and Celeste firmly believed they were the sole proprietors of this estate. They bragged about their home ownership constantly. In reality, the property was owned outright by an irrevocable blind trust that I fully controlled. They possessed merely a conditional right of residency. They were glorified, non-paying tenants, a crucial detail neatly buried deep within a stack of dense legal jargon they had eagerly signed without bothering to read. I was essentially asking permission to stay in a house I legally owned. As I made my request, Mrs. Gable, the notoriously gossipy neighbor from across the street, happened to be walking her golden retriever near our open patio doors. Spotting a potential audience, Celeste immediately activated her flawless maternal persona. She rushed forward with practiced grace, pulling me into a stiff, perfumed embrace. She projected her voice just loud enough for Mrs. Gable to hear, declaring that family always provides a safe harbor during the darkest storms. Graham stepped up right on cue, nodding sagely and adjusting the collar of his cashmere cardigan. He placed a heavy hand on my shoulder and proclaimed that blood is thicker than water, and we would weather this minor financial inconvenience together as a united front. It was a beautiful, heartwarming tableau of American family solidarity. The moment Mrs. D. Gable disappeared down the sidewalk and the heavy mahogany doors clicked shut, the temperature in the foyer plummeted by 10 degrees. The performance ended instantly. Celeste dropped her arms and took a large step back, brushing at her blouse as if my bad luck might be contagious. Graham's benevolent smile vanished completely, replaced by a tight, panicked grimace that contorted his features. By 3 o'clock that exact same afternoon, my polite request for the garden suite was unequivocally denied. Celeste claimed, with a wave of her manicured hand, that she had already promised that specific room to a visiting spiritual advisor for an upcoming weekend meditation retreat. It was a blatant lie, but I did not contest it. Instead of a comfortable bed and fresh air, she directed me to the cramped, windowless storage room situated directly adjacent to the laundry machines on the ground floor. The space was suffocatingly small. It smelled sharply of bleach, damp lint, and neglect. There was no closet, only a rusted metal rack. My bed was a narrow, squeaky cot they had begrudgingly dragged out from the dusty basement. It felt less like a bedroom and more like a holding cell. As I unpacked my meager belongings, Graham stood in the narrow doorway blocking the light. He held a small yellow notepad and a pen. He did not ask how I was holding up. He began listing a series of harsh new household regulations. Since I was no longer contributing financially to the upkeep of the estate, he stated coldly, I needed to drastically minimize my footprint. My showers were strictly limited to 5 minutes to conserve hot water. I was expressly forbidden from using the expensive imported laundry detergent Celeste preferred. I had to buy my own cheap soap if I wanted clean clothes. The central thermostat was locked behind a plastic guard, and I was not permitted to adjust the temperature, regardless of how cold the basement room became at night. I was treated not like a daughter going through the most terrifying professional crisis of her adult life, but like a desperate, untrustworthy vagrant they had reluctantly allowed to sleep in the scullery out of a misplaced sense of civic duty. That first night, I lay rigid on the lumpy mattress, staring up at the exposed copper pipes running across the low ceiling. The walls in that lower section of the house were paper thin. I could hear every sound from the massive kitchen directly above me. I listened intently, waiting for the inevitable conversation. They were not discussing my legal peril. They were not wondering if my life's work was going to be dismantled by ruthless federal auditors. They were not expressing sympathy for my ruined reputation. I heard the sharp, distinct pop of a wine cork. Graham poured 2 heavy glasses. Then, I heard Celeste's voice, shrill and escalating with mounting hysteria. She was hyperventilating over their upcoming 2-week luxury excursion to the Amalfi Coast. The final, exorbitant payment for the villa was due in exactly 10 days, and my accounts were dead. She sobbed, not for me, but about the sheer, crushing humiliation of losing their premium reservation. She cried over the outfits she had already purchased and the bragging rights she would have to forfeit. Graham paced the hardwood floor above, his heavy footsteps echoing like a metronome of anxiety right over my head. He muttered vicious curses about his golf club membership and the upcoming charity gala. He was terrified of the impending country club gossip. He dreaded the moment he would have to look his wealthy, judgmental peers in the eye and explain why his reliable cash cow was suddenly completely dry. He did not refer to me as his child. He referred to me as a massive, catastrophic liability. He angrily asked Celeste how long they would be forced to endure this embarrassment before I managed to fix my own mess and get the money flowing again. I lay perfectly still in the dark, the scent of bleach burning my nose. The trap had sprung flawlessly. Breyer was entirely correct. The prey had stepped right onto the snare, revealing a nature so greedy and devoid of empathy it almost took my breath away. There was no love in this house. There was only a transaction that had suddenly been canceled. No one asked if I was afraid. No one cared if I lost my company. The only thing keeping them awake was the sudden, horrifying drop in the level of luxury they had become fatally addicted to. 14 days was all it took for the last thin veneer of parental affection to completely rot away and expose the barren wasteland underneath. I was no longer a guest seeking refuge in my own house. I was an unwelcome squatter, a heavy burden draining their precious resources. The physical claustrophobia of that laundry-adjacent room began to seep deeply into my bones. The space was constantly humid, smelling sharply of bleach and the sour dampness of wet towels. But the true, terrifying suffocation occurred upstairs in the main living areas, where a quiet, relentless campaign of psychological warfare was being waged against me. Every single piece of food I consumed was heavily monitored and ruthlessly audited. If I poured a second cup of standard drip coffee in the morning before heading to my laptop, Graham would pointedly clear his throat, stare at my mug, and deliver a harsh lecture about the rapidly rising cost of groceries. I was allotted precisely 1 thin slice of generic brand toast for breakfast, while they dined on fresh artisanal pastries and imported fruits purchased with the allowance they still had hoarded from my previous cash transfers. My daily hygiene was suddenly subjected to a strict totalitarian regime. My allotted shower time was brutally enforced by a timer. If I ran the water for more than exactly 5 minutes, Celeste would march down the hallway and rap her knuckles sharply against the thin bathroom door. She would shout that the hot water heater was not a public charity service and that I was showing a disgusting lack of respect for their utility bills. It was a bizarre, twisted reality where I was being aggressively disciplined for using the very water and electricity that my own invisible, offshore trust accounts were secretly continuing to fund in full. The paranoia regarding their assets escalated at a dizzying pace. On the 9th morning of my stay, I walked into the massive kitchen to find the large walk-in pantry secured with a heavy, solid brass padlock. The custom climate-controlled wine cellar in the formal dining room, a cellar stocked entirely with rare vintages I had meticulously sourced and paid for, bore a matching lock. Graham stood by the marble kitchen island, calmly adjusting the cuffs of his tailored shirt, and casually explained that difficult financial times required extreme household discipline. He looked me dead in the eyes and claimed they needed to strictly inventory their provisions to survive the fallout of my irresponsible corporate mess. He was locking my own food away from me, acting like a benevolent captain rationing supplies on a sinking ship I had built. Celeste's methods were more theatrical, designed to inflict maximum emotional guilt. She developed a daily habit of leaving the monthly electricity and water statements squarely in the center of the mahogany dining table, right where I would be forced to see them when I sat down for my meager dinners. She would walk past my chair, let out a long, heavy, dramatic sigh, and mutter bitterly about how the bills were suddenly astronomical now that an extra body was lounging around the house all day. She completely and conveniently ignored the fact that I was still working 14-hour days, managing my firm's supposed legal crisis from a cramped, makeshift desk in a windowless room. While she kept the central air conditioning blasting at a frigid temperature to keep herself comfortable during her afternoon card games, the most glaring, humiliating symbol of their detachment sat gleaming in the pristine driveway. The massive black luxury sport utility vehicle I had bought them remained parked, polished, and largely unused. When a heavy rainstorm hit on the second Tuesday of my confinement, I politely asked Graham if I could borrow the keys just to drive 2 miles to the grocery store to buy my own permitted rations. He looked at me as if I had asked to borrow a vital organ. He coldly and flatly refused. He stated that the vehicle needed to be preserved in perfect showroom condition in case they were forced to sell it to cover the mortgage I was supposedly defaulting on. He then ordered me to call a rideshare service, insisting that I should not be seen driving such a high-profile car around town while my professional reputation was in tatters. They literally forced me to stand in the pouring rain, shivering in a cheap jacket, waiting for a stranger to pick me up, simply because they needed to maintain their own immaculate illusion of wealth for the snooping neighbors. Furthermore, Graham deliberately changed the security code to the main garage doors the very next day, forcing me to enter the property through the muddy side gate like a hired, untrustworthy servant. But the true depth of their depravity, the revelation that finally killed any lingering shred of daughterly devotion, did not fully reveal itself until the end of the second week. I was tasked with cleaning the home office, a demeaning chore Celeste had abruptly assigned to me as a mandatory condition of my continued residency. While emptying a wastebasket beneath Graham's heavy oak desk, I noticed a crumpled piece of heavy stock paper. I smoothed it out on the floor. It was a formal meeting agenda from a boutique wealth management firm downtown, the very firm that employed a close, golf-playing associate of my father from the Civic Club. The agenda was dated from exactly 2 days prior. I scanned the handwritten notes scribbled in my father's unmistakable handwriting in the margins. The words sent a shock of pure, paralyzing ice straight through my veins. The notes detailed a legal strategy for establishing conservatorship and managing distressed assets in the event of an adult child suffering a sudden incapacity to govern their own affairs. I did not confront them. I carefully took a photograph of the document with my phone, slipped the paper back into the trash exactly as I had found it, and took a long walk to a nearby park. I sat on a damp wooden bench and called Briar from a secure, encrypted line. I gave her the name of the wealth management firm and the specific dates. Within 48 hours, Breyer's extensive network of private investigators had uncovered the entire sickening plot. Graham and Celeste had not merely gone to their financial advisor friend for casual parental advice. They were actively and aggressively building a comprehensive legal and medical dossier against me. Breyer confirmed that they were consulting with aggressive estate lawyers, preparing to petition the courts for emergency medical and financial power of attorney over my entire estate. Their logic, meticulously crafted with the help of their country club connections, was that the extreme stress of the federal audit had triggered a severe mental breakdown, rendering me dangerously incompetent to manage my remaining wealth or oversee the liquidation of my company. They did not want to help me salvage my firm. They were eagerly anticipating its total, catastrophic collapse so they could immediately swoop in as my designated legal guardians. Their ultimate goal was to seize whatever capital remained across all my accounts before the imaginary federal authorities could freeze it permanently. They were plotting a hostile, calculated takeover of their own daughter's life and legacy. Sitting on that cold park bench, gripping the phone tightly against my ear, the final shreds of my victimhood burned away completely. The fire was replaced by a cold, calculating, and absolute clarity. I finally understood the terrifying truth of my existence. They were not simply greedy, shallow parents who would abandon me when the money ran dry. They were active, malicious predators, willing to legally declare their only child insane in order to raid her financial corpse. The loyalty test was officially over. It was no longer a psychological experiment to see if they possessed the capacity to love me. It had instantly transformed into a high-stakes game of counter-espionage inside the very house I owned. I walked back to the estate that afternoon a completely different woman. I let the heavy side gate click shut behind me, fully accepting my new role as an infiltrator. I stopped reacting to Celeste's dramatic sighs and passive-aggressive remarks. I stopped asking Graham for small favors or permission to exist in my own space. I became a silent, invisible ghost in their home. I transformed into a meticulous observer, silently recording every single micro-expression, every whispered phone call behind closed doors, and every financial document carelessly left on a kitchen counter. I was gathering the heavy ammunition required to completely dismantle their world, brick by stolen brick. I would let them confidently build their fraudulent legal case. I would let them dig the pit as deep as their boundless greed would allow, and when the time was perfectly right, I was going to push them in and bury them alive. It was late Saturday afternoon, the air thick with the cloying scent of imported citronella candles and roasting meat. Celeste was hosting a twilight dinner party on the back patio for the most elite members of her social circle. I was already feeling deeply unwell. A sharp, twisting ache had planted itself in my lower abdomen right after lunch, radiating outward with a nauseating intensity that left me clammy and breathless. I approached my mother in the kitchen, quietly explaining the severe pain and asking if I could just remain in my cramped basement room for the evening. Celeste scoffed loudly, handing me a massive stack of heavy linen tablecloths. She commanded me to stop making excuses and make myself useful, sharply reminding me that I was currently living under their roof rent-free and owed them my labor. The task she assigned was brutal. I had to haul several heavy crates of crystal glassware, bulky floral centerpieces, and heavy porcelain serving dishes from the elevated stone patio down a steep, narrow flight of outdoor stairs to the lower garden staging area. I knew those stairs intimately, and I knew they were a death trap. 3 separate times over the past 4 weeks, I had sent Graham detailed emails with high-resolution photographs showing the severe wood rot eating away at the main structural support of the right side handrail. I had verbally warned him that the damp cedar was decaying rapidly. He had dismissed every single message and conversation. He claimed replacing the custom wood was a completely unnecessary expense right before the summer entertaining season, accusing me of constantly exaggerating minor aesthetic flaws just to cause trouble. He flatly refused to spend the money. I picked up the second heavy crate of crystal, my stomach muscles clenching in agonizing protest with every step. The sun was setting, casting long, deceptive shadows across the uneven, moss-covered brickwork. As I reached the top step to begin my descent, a sudden, blinding spike of pain shot through my midsection, far worse than before. The agony caused my knees to buckle momentarily. Losing my balance under the weight of the heavy box, I instinctively threw my left hand out, grabbing the wooden railing with all my body weight to steady myself. There was zero resistance. The sound of the rotting wood snapping was terrifyingly loud. Like a dry tree branch breaking in a silent forest, the railing simply disintegrated into damp, spongy splinters beneath my grip. Gravity seized me violently. I tumbled forward, the heavy wooden crate flying from my hands and shattering against the sharp edge of the brick steps. I fell hard, my body twisting awkwardly in the air. My lower abdomen slammed with brutal, devastating force against the solid stone corner of the landing. The impact completely knocked the oxygen from my lungs. A white-hot flare of absolute agony exploded in my gut, so intense and absolute that my vision instantly blacked out at the edges. I lay crumpled on the damp grass at the bottom of the ruined staircase, gasping for air like a drowning woman, unable to move my legs or arms. In any normal household, this would be the moment of pure, unadulterated parental terror. I expected the immediate, panicked rush of footsteps. I expected my father to yell my name, to slide down the stairs to check my pulse. Instead, Graham appeared at the top of the landing, looking down not at my broken body, but at the scattered, ruined crystal, glittering in the twilight. His face was twisted in absolute fury. He shouted down at me, his voice echoing across the lawn, furious that I had completely ruined the centerpiece presentation. He yelled that replacing the imported Italian glasses would cost an absolute fortune and that I was unbelievably clumsy. Celeste rushed out onto the patio seconds later. She completely ignored my inability to stand or speak. She began frantically pulling at her hair, whining loudly to Graham that the luxury catering staff was arriving in exactly 20 minutes and this mess was an unacceptable disaster. Only when I failed to respond to their harsh commands to get up and clean the broken glass, only when they saw me curled in a fetal position coughing up a small, terrifying trace of blood, did they realize I was severely incapacitated. Celeste finally pulled out her phone to call for an ambulance, but her tone was not one of panic. She sounded like a highly inconvenienced hostess complaining about a delayed floral delivery. I heard her actually ask the emergency dispatcher if the paramedics could please park the ambulance down the street and walk up the driveway quietly, specifically requesting they turn off the flashing lights so they would not distress her arriving high society guests. The ride to the trauma center was a dark, agonizing blur of violent bumps and the sterile, metallic smell of the paramedics' equipment. Graham rode in the front seat, complaining incessantly to the driver about the evening traffic ruining their schedule. The moment we arrived, the chaotic, high-speed machinery of the emergency room swallowed me whole. The attending trauma surgeon quickly assessed my rigid, deeply bruised abdomen. He ordered an immediate scan, which revealed massive blunt force trauma. I had suffered severe internal bleeding from a ruptured blood vessel and significant soft tissue damage surrounding my organs. Emergency surgery was the only option to stop the hemorrhaging and save my life. While I was being prepped for the operating room, drifting in and out of a terrified, pain-filled narcotic haze, the hospital financial administrator approached Graham in the waiting area to process the intake. I learned the exact details of this exchange hours later, but the sheer, calculated cruelty of it was perfectly in character. The administrator requested an initial payment method or insurance verification to formally process the emergency surgical intake. Graham possessed a platinum secondary credit card in his wallet at that very moment. It was a card tied directly to my personal corporate accounts, an account I had intentionally left active and fully funded. He could have swiped it without a single second of hesitation. Instead, he coldly and deliberately refused. He crossed his arms, looked the administrator dead in the eye, and stated that my financial affairs were currently a chaotic legal mess. He told the hospital staff that they would just have to figure out the billing on their own because he was not putting his name on any financial liability for my mistakes. He abandoned me financially right at the very threshold of the operating theater. Then, Breyer arrived. I had managed to hit the emergency dial shortcut on my phone while lying immobilized in the wet grass before the ambulance even arrived. She stormed into the hospital lobby like a tactical strike force just after midnight. She bypassed my parents completely, marching straight to the administration desk. She slammed down her own heavy black card, signed every necessary financial guarantee, and authorized the life-saving surgery without blinking. But Breyer did not stop at simply securing my medical care. Her mind was always a cold, calculating engine of strategy. While I was unconscious under the surgeon's knife, she went to work building our arsenal. She formally requested and secured the hospital admission logs, permanently documenting Graham's explicit refusal to provide the payment card he carried. She obtained the official paramedic dispatch report detailing Celeste's bizarre, vain request to hide the ambulance from her dinner guests. Most importantly, she logged into my remote cloud server and pulled the exact digital trail we needed. She downloaded the 3 specific emails I had sent my father warning him about the rotten handrail, complete with timestamps and the high-resolution photos. She also downloaded his dismissive, arrogant replies refusing to authorize the repairs. The snapped wood was no longer just an unfortunate, random household oversight. By explicitly refusing to fix a known, documented structural hazard simply to save a few dollars for a party, and then actively denying medical payment after that exact hazard nearly killed me, my parents had inadvertently handed us the ultimate, devastating weapon. It was no longer a petty family dispute over money. It was now a clear, legally documented case of gross negligence and reckless endangerment. They had enthusiastically built their own legal coffin. All I had to do now was survive the surgery, wake up, and nail the lid shut. I spent 4 days staring at the acoustic tiles of my sterile hospital recovery room, wrapped in a haze of surgical pain and forced reflection. On the morning of my medical discharge, I sent a brief text message to my mother. It was a simple, factual notification that I was being released. I did not send that message because I harbored any lingering delusions of a tearful, loving family reunion. I sent it because I needed to look them in the eyes one final, definitive time. I needed to witness, with absolute and unwavering clarity, the exact volume of humanity they had left inside their souls before I burned their world to the ground. The result was the encounter at the curb. The locked doors of the luxury vehicle, the refusal to look my way, and the crumpled $20 bill casually tossed into the oily puddle at my feet. The metallic, disgusted voice of my mother complaining about the lingering smell of disinfectants. As I sat in the back of the hired car pulling away from the medical center, the city of Charlotte blurring past the tinted windows, I felt a profound, chemical shift in my brain. My abdomen throbbed with a dull, vicious ache from the fresh internal sutures, but my mind was sharper and colder than it had been in a decade. I looked down at my lap. Resting on my thigh was the wet, crumpled $20 bill I had painfully retrieved from the pavement. It was damp with dirty puddle water and smelled faintly of motor oil. When the driver pulled up to the private, subterranean loading dock of my downtown residential building, the fare had already been secured through the application on my phone. I handed the driver the wet bill anyway. I told him to keep it as an extra gratuity. I refused to keep that specific piece of paper in my possession for another second. Handing it over felt like physically stamping the opening receipt for the final reckoning. It was the absolute cheapest buyout of a bloodline in recorded human history. The private elevator ascended smoothly to the 98th floor. When the polished steel doors parted, stepping into my penthouse felt like stepping onto a completely different planet. The apartment was a sprawling, immaculate expanse of floor-to-ceiling glass, cold gray marble, and minimalist Italian furniture. It was a high-altitude fortress my parents did not even know existed. Waiting for me at the massive quartz dining table were Nolan Voss and Briar McCall. The surface of the table was completely covered with open laptops, glowing monitors, neatly stacked legal dossiers, and steaming cups of black coffee. They looked less like my corporate attorney and my media strategist, and more like a tactical military tribunal preparing to authorize a devastating drone strike. I walked slowly over to the table, forcing myself to ignore the sharp, tearing sensation in my core, and took the seat at the head. I did not need to debrief them on the hospital curb encounter. Breyer took one look at my face, saw the dead, flat, absolute emptiness in my eyes, and simply nodded. She pushed a sleek silver laptop toward me and handed me a heavy gold fountain pen. I gave the execution orders in a voice that I barely recognized. It was completely devoid of hesitation, grief, or doubt. I instructed Nolan to immediately contact the executive branch of my wealth management division. I ordered the permanent, irreversible freezing of every single secondary credit card issued to Graham and Celeste Jenkins, the platinum travel accounts, the premium dining cards, the exclusive department store charge lines, all of them, terminated with extreme prejudice. I then targeted the absolute lifeblood of their daily existence. I ordered the immediate and total cessation of the automated monthly allowance wire transfers that silently fed their joint checking account. Next on the chopping block was the black luxury sport utility vehicle. I authorized the immediate cancellation of the premium insurance policy covering that specific asset. Under the strict, ironclad terms of the vehicle's title, which my holding company owned, operating the machine without full premium coverage was a material breach of contract. This legal maneuver allowed my security team to remotely disable the engine block via the onboard satellite telematics system. The car was now nothing more than a $75,000 paperweight sitting in their driveway. They were permanently grounded. Finally, we moved to the residential estate. I told Nolan to activate the nuclear option. We triggered the immediate termination clause regarding their conditional right of residency. Nolan drafted the formal eviction notice, giving them exactly 96 hours to vacate the premises entirely before formal. Public removal proceedings would be initiated by the county sheriff's department. Nolan did not stop there. He slid a crisp, thick legal document across the cold quartz surface of the table. It was a formal spoliation of evidence mandate. He was dispatching a private process server to physically hand them a legally binding order to preserve the ruined outdoor staircase and all associated digital communications. The document explicitly laid the aggressive groundwork for a massive civil liability lawsuit regarding my near-fatal injuries, effectively trapping them in a brutal legal corner. If my father tried to quietly fix the rotting stairs to hide the hazard, he would be committing felony destruction of evidence. If he left it untouched, it stood as a permanent, undeniable monument to his gross, almost homicidal negligence. As I signed the final authorization, Breyer leaned forward, her expression turning distinctly predatory. She tapped a thick manila folder resting near my left elbow. She explained that while I was unconscious under heavy anesthesia on the operating table, her forensic accounting team had flagged a highly suspicious, critical anomaly in my broader financial portfolio. Exactly 2 weeks prior, while I was living in their damp basement eating tightly rationed slices of cheap bread, Graham and Celeste had made a bold, breathtakingly desperate move. They had attempted to forcibly penetrate a high-yield private equity fund held solely in my name at a boutique downtown brokerage firm. They did not just ask the broker nicely. They had submitted a completely fabricated durable power of attorney document. The paperwork was complete with a forged notary public seal and a heavily doctored physician's statement falsely claiming I had suffered a total psychological collapse and was mentally unfit to manage my own assets. The brokerage's internal fraud department had immediately flagged the amateurish forgery, locking the digital portal and denying the transfer. But my parents had left a glaring, undeniable, and highly illegal paper trail of their attempted grand larceny. They had crossed the definitive line from being emotionally abusive, greedy parents to committing actionable, federal financial fraud. The late afternoon sun began to set over the Charlotte skyline, casting long, sharp, golden shadows across the marble floor of the penthouse. I sat back in the leather chair and looked at the mountain of printed evidence, the drafted termination notices, and the undeniable proof of their criminal intent. The woman who had stood trembling on the hospital curb just a few hours ago, harboring a pathetic, lingering hope for a ride home, was completely dead and buried. By 5 o'clock that evening, I was no longer a victim seeking validation. I was no longer a daughter trying to buy love. I was the architect of their total, systematic destruction. I had become the sole, undisputed authority in the universe deciding exactly what my parents were going to lose, the precise, agonizing order in which they would lose it, and exactly how deeply the consequences would cut into their flesh. The crumpled $20 bill tossed into the dirty water had been the final signal flare. The grace period was over, and the war of attrition had officially begun. I sat in the absolute silence of my downtown penthouse, watching the digital notifications roll across my laptop screen. Breyer had stationed a discreet private investigator near the suburban shopping district to ensure my parents did not cause a public disturbance that might circle back to my corporate reputation. Through the investigator's real-time text updates and the cascade of declined transaction alerts hitting my inbox, I watched my parents' carefully constructed universe shatter into pieces. The sheer speed of their downfall was a beautiful, terrifying thing to witness. At exactly 2 o'clock in the afternoon, my father walked into a high-end horology boutique. He was accompanied by 2 of his wealthiest friends from the country club, men whose approval he valued above his own breathing. Graham was trying to purchase a vintage imported watch, a piece priced at roughly $40,000, purely to show off his enduring financial dominance despite his daughter's supposed legal troubles. He leaned against the polished glass display case, laughing loudly with his friends, and handed the clerk his glossy black secondary card. The clerk swiped the plastic. The terminal emitted a sharp, negative beep. Graham smiled a tight, condescending smile, loudly blaming a banking security measure, and told the young man to run it again. The clerk complied. The same sharp beep echoed in the quiet store. The clerk lowered his voice, politely informing my father that the issuing bank had completely frozen the account. Graham's face turned a violent shade of purple. His friends abruptly stopped laughing, suddenly finding the ceiling tiles incredibly interesting. My father snatched the card back, muttering furiously about incompetent bankers, and stormed out of the boutique, leaving his shredded dignity on the pristine marble floor. While Graham was being humiliated among the watch cases, Celeste was experiencing her own public execution at a luxury department store across the plaza. She had piled the cosmetics counter high with imported facial serums, rare perfumes, and designer makeup palettes. When the cashier presented the total, Celeste casually handed over her premium platinum card. The system instantly rejected it. Annoyed, she dug into her designer purse and produced a second card. Denied. Her breathing grew shallow as she handed over a third option, a card reserved for emergency travel expenses. The machine rejected that one as well. A line of impatient, impeccably dressed women had formed behind her. They began to shift their weight and whisper to one another. Celeste, a woman who had built her entire identity on being the wealthiest person in any given room, was forced to snatch her empty purse and walk away from the mountain of luxury goods. She had to endure the searing, pitying glances of the sales associates and the open disdain of her peers. They retreated to the sweltering outdoor parking lot, meeting beside the massive black sport utility vehicle. They were both shaking with rage, completely convinced that my financial mess had merely caused a temporary administrative glitch. They climbed into the leather seats. Graham pressed the ignition button. The engine remained completely dead. Instead of the familiar roar of a powerful motor, the digital dashboard illuminated with a stark red warning message. The vehicle telematics system informed them that the engine immobilizer had been activated remotely due to a canceled insurance policy by the registered owner. The car was entirely bricked. They were trapped in a baking parking lot in a $75,000 piece of useless metal. While they sat sweating in the silent vehicle, both of their phones chimed in unison. It was an automated email from the Brookglass Civic Club Board of Directors. The message formally stated that their quarterly membership dues, which had always been automatically drafted from the accounts I just closed, had failed to process. Effective immediately, their membership privileges were fully suspended. They were barred from the dining room, the golf course, and all social events until the balance was settled. The absolute worst fear they harbored, the loss of their elite social standing, had just become a recorded reality. They were forced to call a cheap local taxi to take them back to the estate. sitting in the stained back seat in complete, terrified silence. The true devastation arrived right after sunset. I was pouring myself a glass of cold water when my phone screen lit up with an incoming call from Graham. I let it ring 3 times before sliding my finger across the glass to answer. I did not say hello. I just listened to the heavy, furious breathing on the other end of the line. Graham did not sound like a concerned father. He sounded like a feral animal trapped in a corner. He screamed into the receiver, his voice echoing with absolute rage. He demanded to know what kind of sick game I was playing. He ordered me to immediately call the banks, unlock the vehicles, and fix the country club issue before he came downtown and dragged me out of whatever hole I was hiding in. He used his deepest, most terrifying voice, the exact same tone that had made me shake with guilt and obedience since I was a small child. But as I stood looking out over the glittering city skyline, I felt absolutely nothing. My heart rate did not increase. My hands did not tremble. The psychological chains he had wrapped around my mind for 34 years had dissolved completely. I let him yell until his voice cracked. When he finally paused to take a breath, I spoke. My voice was quiet, flat, and completely devoid of mercy. I told him that I did not own the house he was standing in, and neither did he. I informed him that exactly 10 minutes ago, a private process server had taped a formal notice of lease termination to his heavy front door. I advised him to go read it. I told him he had exactly 96 hours to pack his personal clothing and vacate the premises before the county sheriff arrived to throw his belongings onto the street. I heard Celeste screaming hysterically in the background. She had just logged into her private laptop and discovered that her personal checking account, the one she used to hide money from my father, was completely frozen. She shrieked that she could not even buy groceries, that she had no cash to borrow, and that she was completely ruined. Graham tried to muster his authority one last time, threatening to sue me for everything I owned, claiming I owed them for raising me. I took a slow sip of my water. I told him he could certainly try to sue me, but he would have a very hard time finding a lawyer to represent a man facing federal forgery charges. The silence that fell over the phone line was profound. It was the sound of a massive, impenetrable ego suddenly hitting a concrete wall. I calmly explained that my forensic accounting team had secured the fabricated durable power of attorney he and Celeste had submitted to my private equity firm. I mentioned the forged notary stamp and the fraudulent medical evaluation. I told him that the evidence was already neatly organized in a file, sitting on my attorney's desk, fully prepared for submission to the federal authorities. The blustering arrogance evaporated instantly. The terrifying realization washed over Graham. He finally understood that he was no longer dealing with a desperate daughter begging for scraps of affection. He was negotiating with a hostile corporate entity that held the keys to his freedom. From thinking he could simply yell and bully his way back to luxury, he suddenly realized that the ground beneath his feet had completely collapsed, and he was staring straight down into the dark abyss of a federal prison sentence. I did not wait for his response. I ended the call, set the phone down on the marble counter, and enjoyed the quiet night. Instead of the crushing weight of impending federal charges forcing a sincere, desperate apology, the realization that they were legally cornered triggered a completely different survival instinct in my parents. They chose the dirtiest, most familiar weapon in their arsenal. They chose the suburban smear campaign. Within 24 hours of our final phone call, the vicious whispers began to circulate through the manicured lawns, the tennis courts, and the mahogany dining rooms of their elite social circle. They did not admit to the forged documents or the canceled credit lines. They certainly did not mention the rotting staircase or the hospital abandonment. Instead, Graham and Celeste launched a perfectly choreographed, highly aggressive offensive, casting themselves as the tragic, aging victims of a mentally unstable, wildly ungrateful daughter. The narrative they spun was a masterpiece of upper-middle-class manipulation, carefully designed to elicit maximum sympathy from people who traded in gossip like currency. They told their horrified friends at the Brook Glass Civic Club that the heavy anesthesia and the severe trauma of the emergency surgery had triggered a massive, irreversible psychotic break in my mind. They claimed I had become a paranoid, controlling megalomaniac overnight. The true story of me being left bleeding on the hospital curb was twisted into a malicious, paranoid delusion I had entirely fabricated to justify my sudden, unprovoked cruelty toward them. According to their tearful recounting over afternoon tea and evening cocktails, I was currently being aggressively brainwashed by my ruthless corporate attorney and my cold-blooded media strategist. They painted Breyer and Nolan as parasitic, opportunistic manipulators who had deliberately isolated me from my loving family in order to systematically drain my corporate assets for their own personal gain. It was a brilliant, venomous lie, designed to completely discredit anything I might say or do before I even had the chance to present my side of the story. They were salting the earth of my reputation so that nothing I planted there would ever grow. Graham did not stop at mere neighborhood gossip. Desperate to maintain his physical grip on the sprawling estate he still believed was his rightful kingdom, he ventured into a decaying strip mall on the outskirts of the city and hired a desperate litigator. This attorney, likely working for a flat fee my father had scraped together by pawning a few remaining valuables, immediately filed an emergency injunction at the county courthouse. The legal filing was a frantic, messy, shotgun approach document aimed squarely at stalling the 96-hour eviction process. It wildly cited alleged elder abuse, severe emotional distress, and my supposed sudden mental incompetence as imperative reasons to halt the removal. It was a transparent, pathetic attempt to buy time. Graham was gambling on the idea that the sheer stress of a messy, prolonged public legal battle would eventually force me to fold, drop the eviction, and quietly reinstate their luxurious allowances just to make the headache go away. Celeste, true to her nature, took a much more theatrical, emotionally manipulative approach. On a rainy Tuesday morning, my building concierge called my secure line to inform me there was a highly emotional disturbance occurring in the main lobby. I rode the private elevator down to the ground floor to find my mother putting on an award-winning performance for the bewildered doormen and passing affluent residents. She was dressed in a simple, understated beige trench coat, a stark, calculated departure from her usual flashy designer wear, and she was clutching a damp tissue. Her face was streaked with perfectly calibrated tears, her makeup artfully smudged to convey deep maternal suffering. When the polished steel doors opened and I stepped out, she rushed toward me, her voice trembling and cracking. She loudly begged her little girl to please come back to her senses. She wailed, making sure her voice echoed off the high marble walls, that she forgave me for everything, that a family should never let a misunderstanding over money tear them apart, and that my father's heart was breaking from the separation. It was the exact same heavy emotional trap I had fallen into 100 times before over the last 34 years. The public spectacle, the manufactured tears, the heavy, suffocating implication that I was the cold-hearted monster tearing the loving family apart. But standing in that cold, bright lobby, looking at the very same woman who had casually thrown a crumpled $20 bill into a puddle of dirty water while I bled, I felt absolutely nothing but a deep, clinical disgust. I did not raise my voice. I did not engage in the manufactured drama. I did not offer a single word of defense or explanation. I simply looked her directly in the eyes, a gaze devoid of any remaining daughterly affection. I turned to the head of building security, calmly instructed him to permanently add her face to the banned trespassers list and to call the police if she ever returned. And then I turned my back on her weeping figure. I stepped back into the elevator and rode straight back up to my sanctuary, leaving her to sob to an empty room. While Graham and Celeste were busy exhausting themselves with their pathetic amateur theater, my team was operating with the lethal, silent efficiency of a tactical strike force. Breyer was not wasting a single second responding to the country club rumors. She was quietly, methodically archiving the absolute, undeniable truth. Her digital vault of evidence grew heavier and more devastating by the hour. She formally secured the unedited, high-definition hospital security footage. The video was crisp and damning. It clearly showed the black luxury vehicle stopping, the tinted window cracking open just a fraction, the money fluttering down into the dirt, and the car speeding away while I stood hunched over, clutching my wounded stomach. She organized the chronological timeline of my ignored emails regarding the rotting staircase, complete with red receipts. She compiled the undeniable bank records showing the exact minute my accounts were frozen, immediately followed by the frantic, illegal attempts to breach my private equity funds using the fabricated power of attorney document. She even recovered deleted text messages between my parents from the night of my surgery, casually discussing how to lock down the money before the anesthesia wore off. Then, Nolan unearthed the absolute crown jewel of our case. During a deep forensic sweep of my father's recovered communications, an email surfaced that made the air in the penthouse turn to ice. It was a message Graham had sent to a senior banking executive exactly 4 months prior, long before the wooden stairs ever collapsed. In this chillingly polite email, my father casually inquired about the specific legal mechanisms required for a family member to assume emergency financial oversight in the event that the primary account holder suffered a catastrophic, incapacitating physical injury. It was the ultimate, terrifying proof of premeditation. They had not simply panicked in the heat of the moment during my surgery. They had been actively praying for a tragedy. They had been silently, patiently calculating the exact legal pathways to my fortune, treating my potential death or severe injury not as a horrifying nightmare, but as a highly anticipated retirement payout. The instinct for any high-profile corporate executive facing a vicious, coordinated public smear campaign is to immediately retaliate, to issue fierce press releases, and to aggressively shut down the rumors before they impact the bottom line. But looking at the mountain of devastating, irrefutable evidence Nolan and Breyer had assembled on the court's table, I made a completely different tactical decision. I ordered absolute, total silence from my camp. I refused to engage in a messy, public war of words. I refused to defend my sanity to people who only cared about their next country club tea time. I realized that the greatest mistake you can make when your enemies are actively destroying themselves is to interrupt them. I wanted Graham and Celeste to feel confident. I wanted them to believe their pathetic legal stall tactics and their neighborhood lies were actually working. I needed them to step so far into the snare, to commit so deeply to their fraudulent narrative, that turning back or claiming a misunderstanding would be a physical and legal impossibility. My strategic silence heavily emboldened them, convinced I was paralyzed by the public shame and terrified of their legal threats. Graham's discount lawyer pushed aggressively forward. He formally demanded a hearing before a superior court judge. He wanted to consolidate the eviction dispute, the questions regarding my mental fitness, and his absurd counterclaims into one massive, definitive legal showdown, fully expecting me to surrender before we ever saw the inside of a courtroom. It was exactly the fatal mistake we were waiting for. Nolan smoothly agreed to the consolidated docket without raising a single objection. The court officially scheduled a comprehensive, binding hearing. It was set for a Thursday morning, exactly 2 weeks away. This would not be a private negotiation or a quiet, swept-under-the-rug settlement behind closed doors. It would be a sprawling, public judicial proceeding where the strict rules of evidence applied, where perjury carried a mandatory prison sentence, and where the complete, unvarnished truth would be permanently entered into the public record. The masks were finally going to be ripped off under the harsh, unforgiving fluorescent lights of a courtroom, and I was going to ensure they never found a way to put them back on. The courtroom was a stark, unforgiving arena that stood in massive contrast to the luxurious, insulated world my parents were so desperately trying to cling to. It smelled faintly of lemon floor wax and old paper, illuminated by harsh, buzzing fluorescent lights that offered absolutely no shadows to hide in. I sat quietly beside Nolan at the heavy oak plaintiff table, wearing a tailored charcoal suit that felt like a suit of armor. Across the wide center aisle, Graham and Celeste were already putting on the theatrical performance of a lifetime. They had intentionally dressed down for the occasion. My father wore a slightly wrinkled, dull gray suit that purposely made him look frail and diminished, while my mother had completely abandoned her heavy designer jewelry and perfect makeup. They huddled closely together at their table, trying their absolute best to look like two terrified, vulnerable, elderly victims facing a ruthless corporate machine. When the honorable judge called the hearing to order, the discount attorney my father had hired immediately launched into a highly emotional, completely baseless opening statement. He aggressively painted me as a deeply unstable, vindictive woman who had suffered a severe post-operative mental breakdown. He called Graham to the witness stand first. My father slowly walked up, placed his right hand on the holy book, swore to tell the whole truth, and immediately began lying with breathtaking ease. He spoke with a carefully manufactured, trembling voice, claiming to the court that I had explicitly promised them the massive estate as a permanent, unconditional gift to thank them for their years of unwavering parental support. He testified under oath that my sudden decision to freeze their accounts and issue an eviction notice was an act of uncontrollable, insane retaliation for imaginary slights. Celeste wept openly in the wooden gallery benches, nodding along as he detailed how they had always rushed to my side during every single crisis, sacrificing their own health and happiness to care for me. I felt absolutely no anger watching them commit perjury. I just felt a cold, clinical detachment. I gave Nolan a brief, silent nod. He stood up, buttoned his suit jacket, and approached the bench. He did not raise his voice or engage in their cheap emotional theatrics. He simply began handing the judge a stack of crisp, undeniable reality. First, he submitted the original, heavily notarized trust agreement for the property. He methodically pointed out the specific, ironclad termination clauses and the extremely clear legal definition of their conditional residency. He proved, beyond a shadow of a legal doubt, that they had never owned a single brick or blade of grass on that property. The judge carefully examined the documents, his expression turning distinctly cold as he peered over his glasses at my father. But the property dispute was merely the opening skirmish. Nolan called Breyer to present the digital evidence we had gathered. The court bailiff dimmed the overhead lights, and the large television monitor mounted on the side wall flickered to life. The high-definition hospital security footage began to play. The entire courtroom watched in absolute horrified silence as the massive black luxury vehicle pulled up to the hospital curb. They watched the heavy tinted passenger window roll down exactly 2 inches. They watched my mother casually drop the crumpled $20 bill directly into a filthy puddle of water. And then, the court watched me, hunched over in visible agony, clutching my freshly bleeding abdomen as I painfully bent down to retrieve the wet money while my parents simply accelerated and drove away. The silence in the room was thick and suffocating. It was a heavy collective disgust that seemed to press down physically on Graham and Celeste, but Nolan was far from finished. He immediately submitted the sworn, signed affidavit from the hospital financial administrator. The document confirmed that Graham had explicitly refused to use the active secondary credit card sitting right in his wallet to pay for my emergency, life-saving surgery. Following that, Nolan projected the series of emails I had sent weeks prior. The messages explicitly warned my father about the rotting outdoor staircase, complete with high-resolution photographs of the danger, followed by his arrogant, dismissive replies refusing to spend a single dime on repairs. The false narrative of a tragic, unavoidable household accident completely evaporated into thin air, instantly replaced by documented, undeniable negligence that had nearly resulted in my death. The final, devastating blow was delivered a few minutes later by a senior fraud investigator from my wealth management firm. He took the witness stand and closely examined the durable power of attorney document my parents had attempted to submit. He walked the judge through the amateurish, desperate forgery, pointing out the obviously doctored physician's signature and the completely fake notary public stamp. He confirmed for the official record that the attempt to seize my private equity funds had been immediately flagged as a fraudulent, criminal act before a single dollar could be transferred. The judge did not even need to recess to deliberate. He looked down at Graham and Celeste with a mixture of profound anger and absolute judicial contempt. He struck down every single one of their delay requests with a sharp, echoing bang of his wooden gavel. He fully upheld the eviction notice, ordering them to vacate the property within 24 hours. Then, he delivered the killing strike. He formally announced to the courtroom that he was forwarding the forged power of attorney documents directly to the district attorney office for an independent criminal investigation regarding felony financial fraud. Court was abruptly dismissed. Graham and Celeste completely collapsed into their chairs. The color drained entirely from their faces as the terrifying reality of potential prison time finally broke through their lifelong delusions of invincibility. I stood up, calmly gathered my legal files, and walked out the heavy double doors into the wide marble hallway. They scrambled out of the courtroom right after me, their previous arrogance completely gone. They cornered me near the elevator banks. They were no longer angry. They were consumed by sheer panic. Celeste reached out to grab my arm, her voice a high-pitched wail of pure terror, begging me to withdraw the criminal complaint, promising they would leave the state, promising they would do whatever I wanted. Graham was stammering uncontrollably, his hands shaking violently, asking how his own flesh and blood could possibly destroy him like this. I looked at the two terrified strangers standing before me. I opened my slim leather briefcase and reached inside. I pulled out the exact same $20 bill from the hospital curb. It was dry now, carefully pressed flat, but it was still permanently stained with the dark oil of the puddle. I stepped forward and placed the bill gently onto the polished wooden bench sitting right between them. I looked my mother directly in the eyes. "Take a taxi," I said, my voice perfectly steady and completely devoid of any emotion. "I do not want my life smelling like you two anymore." I turned around and walked toward the waiting elevator. I did not look back once. Behind me stood two people who had just permanently lost their luxury estate, their unlimited access to my wealth, their elite social standing, and their absolute final chance at redemption. I stepped into the elevator car and watched the polished steel doors slide shut, severing the connection forever. An hour later, I was back at Meridian Harbor Risk Advisory. The office was quiet and empty. I walked into my corner suite, turned on the warm overhead lights, and sat down at my heavy mahogany desk. I opened my laptop, ready to work, and felt a profound, incredible sense of peace wash over my entire body. I finally understood that true justice was not about screaming louder than the people who hurt you. It was about calmly, quietly closing the door at the exact right moment, and having the absolute strength to never open it again. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. Please drop a comment below and let me know where you are listening from so we can connect and share our thoughts together. I invite you to subscribe to the Maya Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support us even further by pressing the hype button so that the story in this video can be heard by many more people.